come to the 10th presentation of Hermetic America, and we're looking at the hidden core, which is a fulcrum for polarity, but is a pivot for a rotational dynamic. The polarity carries an electrical kinetic, but the pivot carries a magnetic pivot. And they're related as electricity and magnetism are related, of being complementarities in terms of the reality of energy. The fulcrum in Hermetic America with the polarity is in between church and state. The pivot in Hermetic America is of the reality of the person. And we live in a time where, again, the great tidal thresholds of the polarity between church and state are in danger of swirling out of recognition the reality of the person. Whereas the major theme in Hermetic America is always focused on the primordiality of the reality of the person, and that church and state are expressive societal modes that are only part of a larger spectrum for the reality of the person, that the person has a spectrum of possibilities, and that church and state are always antithetical in terms of the society. The reason for this archetype goes back to the time of Jesus. One of the earliest expressions of the necessity in the Hermetic America tradition to find not just the core of oneself, which would be the pivot, which would be the fulcrum that needs to be transformed to a pivot. The core is an integral, whereas the pivot is a differential quality. And the differential has the qualities of the ecology of consciousness, whereas the core has the qualities of space-time in its integral cycle. So that there is a cycling of the polarity of church and state that tends to reoccur, and part of its reoccurrence carries with it, since ancient times, the sense that there is a fate or there is a destiny. The Greek term for it was moira, and destiny was so strong in the early Greek ethos that even the Olympian gods were subject to destiny. And that in this understanding, by 400 BC, Thucydides was able to write in the Peloponnesian War that understanding now what he does about history, about the state, all of the events, the characters, the protagonists, the antagonists that he writes about will all reoccur again, unless there is a conscious interjection into the state to change the cycle of destiny. at the very same time that Thucydides was establishing this, the last play of Euripides, the Bacchae, was being produced. Euripides at 70 was exiled from Athens about the same time that Socrates was being interrogated by the tyranny, growing tyranny, controlling Athens. And in his exile, the Bacchae shows that there is a vengeant destiny that cannot be escaped as long as there is no transform in man. And that the transform in man, in Euripides' Bacchae, is indexed by the relationship of a man to women, and that if he does not have a transform in that relationship, he will be subjected to a tragic denouement. This will occur. And at the same time as Thucydides establishes the crushing destiny cycle of repeating history, of repeating characters, repeating antagonists, and Euripides showing the great tragic flaw in the nature of man not to recognize the humanity not only of other men, but the humanity of women. At the very same time, a third prong was Plato, who was just beginning to write his great dialogues. And just as Thucydides had said, there is a relentless cycle to the state, Plato showed there is a relentless cycle to the church, to religion, that again and again the same cyclic scenarios play out. And in between Thucydides' critique of the state and Plato's critique of the religion that binds in churches, in temples, and Euripides' focus in pointing to the inevitable tragic flaw in man. All of this came to the need 400 years later for there to be a radical transform to the church and the state, and to take the tragic trigger out of man permanently. This was the confluence that happened in Alexandria in the time of Jesus. He was born about 9 BC. He was taken to Egypt by his father Joseph. They were there for about 5 years, returned back to Judea, and instead opted to go to Galilee because the inheritor of the Herod house ruling Judea was suspect to Joseph in his dreams, and so they went to Galilee and were there for 7 years. And at age 12, Jesus left again and went back to Egypt again, but went back as a 12-year-old Jewish boy ready for his year of preparation for his bar mitzvah at 13. And where he went was the most sophisticated meditational, contemplative community in the world, about 25 miles to the west of Alexandria, at Taposiris Magna. Now, Alexandria was surrounded by 2 Taposiris locations. Taposiris Minor is to the east, not far from Canopus, which was a very distant suburb of the greater metropolitan area of Alexandria, but Taposiris Magna about a little bit further to the west. These sites had to do with the re-emergence of Osiris in ancient Egyptian mythological religion, which was also the mythological state understanding And Taposiris Magna was the place where there was a great temple of Osiris. And it was directly related to the great center of Alexandria, because the great building in Alexandria, the tallest building in the world for many hundreds of years, almost 1,500 years, was the great lighthouse at Pharos. And there was a 1/4 scale Pharos lighthouse at Taposiris Magna, because it was on a low ridge in between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean Sea. On the Mareotis side, there were docks and quays, there were harbors, because that area at the time of Jesus was an area of vineyards, of wheat fields, of pottery making in kilns, so that the wine could be shipped all over the Mediterranean world and even into the far reaches of Arabia, Ethiopia, and even India. And olive oil, so that oil, wine, and bread were conspicuous. It was like the Napa Valley of California at the time. That temple of Osiris has been explored archaeologically just in the last couple of months. And on the net, one can find a fresh story just in the last couple of days that the Minister of Antiquities in Egypt, Zahi Hawass, disclosed that at the ruins of the temple of Osiris at Taposiris Magna, they found a mask of Mark Antony. They found a head of Cleopatra. They found a bronze statue of Aphrodite and a number of coins with Cleopatra's profile on them. They were looking at the temple of Osiris to try to find evidence of Cleopatra's tomb, of Mark Antony's tomb, of the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the beginning of the Roman Empire under Augustus. What they were unknowing of is that on the highest ridge, a hill in effect, was the site of the ancient Therapeutae community where Jesus went at age 12 and stayed there until he was 42 years of age. Became the head of that entire meditative community in 14 AD, at the time when Augustus Caesar died and Tiberius Caesar came into power. What was happening was that there was a series of distilled communities that had telescoped together powerfully in the time of Jesus, under Jesus, and became like an archetypal harmonic, that all of the wisdom traditions of the civilized world, from Ireland to India, from Scythia to Ethiopia and Central Africa, that in that great diamond of civilizations, they were all focused at the time in the brilliance of Jesus, so that they became an archetypal pattern that would always not just unfold in a cycle of the integral, but would disclose its full spectrum of possibilities were there to be a lens capable of diffracting that spectrum, of creating that rainbow of possibilities. Were there not to be the transformed maturity of the personal lensing of consciousness, the spectrum would be invisible. And only the integral archetype would play itself out, and that this was the nature of destiny. That destiny was a one-sided curtailing of the dimensions of man, and only when the dimensions of man were restored by withdrawal, by purification, by application, by transformation, that those extra dimensions of consciousness would come into play and the invisible would become visible. The great invisible spirit that was indeed there but unseen could be seen, which is why the field, the differential conscious field, is best described as a field of vision. And vision is distinct from dreams, though related to them. Dreams come from the interplay of the mind and the body in experience, in the images and the feeling tones and the language of experience. But if one masters dreams to the transform threshold, one now is able not only to understand dreams, to interpret dreams, but to understand and interpret visions. The book of Daniel in the Old Testament is the archetypal dream workbook. And it was written by the teacher of righteousness about 160 BC. He was the founder of Qumran, but he left Qumran and went to Alexandria and was in the city of Alexandria at the great library, across the great boulevard that ran north and south and intersected the great boulevard that ran east and west. And right at the confluence of these two great, huge boulevards was the center of Alexandria, the center of the city, the center of a new world civilization. And the tomb of Alexander the Great was there. And right across the great, huge north-south boulevard was a new section of the great library of Alexandria. And that new section was built by Julius Caesar because he had been helped winning a struggle for Egypt in Alexandria, especially by a group of Jewish merchants, the head of which was of a family that within a couple of generations took always the names for their sons that incorporated the names of the Caesars who were operative at the head of the empire. Two of these names, one of them Marcus Julius Caesar, the other Tiberius Julius Alexander, Marcus Julius Alexander and Tiberius Julius Alexander, were the nephews of Philo of Alexandria, the sons of Philo's brother, Alexander Lysimachus, and they were the inheritors from their grandfather, who had been the one who had helped Julius Caesar win the Alexandrian War, maintain his life, and come to become the dictator of the Roman Republic and the forerunner of Augustus Caesar, his nephew, who became the founder of the Roman Empire. In the meantime, the teacher of righteousness had studied and lived at that site in the new library because part of the old library had been burnt. When Caesar's ships were burnt in the harbor, they caught the warehouses along the front of the harbor, and part of the great library. And so a huge recompense for their loss was to build an extension of the Museum, the Temple of the Muses, which was the great library, so that it now stretched all the way from the Bruchion, which was the royal palace district, with an exedra that was an elevated walkway spaced with places for people to stop and have philosophic conversations, to be able to write, to be able to read their scrolls. And the teacher of righteousness gave his name later to that great boulevard, so that even today it's called the Boulevard of Nebi Daniel, the prophet Daniel. Across from that new part was not only the tomb of Alexander, but right next to it was the great, huge villa complex of the Alexander family, of Philo's family. And it was in the lower regions of that villa that abutted with only a wall in between. The area of the Soma, the building where the body of Alexander the Great was, and there was a cruciform indentation cut into the bedrock underneath the villa, and at the confluence of this cross was a sarcophagus. And it was in that sarcophagus that the body of John the Baptist was sent by Jesus from Palestine through the port of Tyre into Alexandria and taken and put into that area almost contiguous to the body of Alexander the Great. A graphic architectural telescoping of the enormous energies and vitality of not just images and symbols and types, but of archetypes, of transform symbols, which are a mathematic and not simply an integral, and of a kind of a language which then jumps into a poetic of personal, conscious dimensioning. So that you have, in the time of Jesus, a radical transform through the introduction of a way in which the personal dimensions, joining the field of visionary differential consciousness with the field of nature, produced a complex plasma out of which came then the lensing of the personal and its ability to give the spectrum of possibility through the range, the scalar, of what is historically possible. So that mythological experience could be pulled through the symbolic structure of the mind into the plasma of a five-dimensional conscious space-time and produce the jewel lensing of the personal form, which would be a six-dimensional form. But in order to do this, it required a depth of endurance to make sure that you were not co-opted by the world, either by the state or the church, and that you were not frightened by the possibility of the tragedy of life, and incidentally, not lured by the comedy of life as well. So that the Greek term for keeping in balance this pair of pairs, not just church and state, but comedy and tragedy, the Greek term is sophrazine, and it means the kind of balance which allows a space of contemplation wherein is possible for the first time philosophy, And so the Platonic dialogues are neither comedy nor tragedy, but they are uplifting to achieve the endurance to take mythological experience and transform it through the fermentation of the field of vision. We have a graphic portrayal of an alcove of contemplation that dates from that time. This was the house of Mary Magdalene on the slopes of a hill in Ephesus on the Aegean. This house was built for her by a crew. The crew included 2 apostles as full-grown men and a 3rd apostle as a young man who was 12 going on 13, ready for his bar mitzvah the next year, and the tutor who was tutoring him, because that 3rd apostle was the future St. John. The other 2 apostles are St. Philip and St. Nathaniel, often given the appellation Bartholomew. Bar Ptolemy is actually Bar, son. Ptolemy is Ptolemy. So the father of Nathaniel's name was Ptolemy, and they were living in Cana, which was just a few miles away from the site of Nazareth, where Jesus' family lived for many years. Even though Jesus left at 12, his 4 brothers and 4 sisters were all born there. The oldest sister, Salome, was born in Egypt, but the others were born there. And the apostle Nathaniel is actually related to Jesus, and that's why at his marriage at Cana, where the water was turned into wine, Jesus' mother was the one largely in charge of saying to Jesus, they have no wine, and told the servants that they should do what he says. All of this came to an exodus within about 6 months after the resurrection. The crucifixion resurrection was in 36 AD, and by early 37 AD, there was a massive exodus from Jerusalem, from Judea, from Galilee, and 12 members of that entourage went to Glastonbury in England, and 12 went to Ephesus on the Aegean. And St. Thomas went to India. Thaddeus and Matthew went into Armenia and Parthia. Simon Zelotes went along the coast of Africa, and James the Less went into Mesopotamia. Judas, of course, was not included. This house, with this contemplative alcove, has been rebuilt and still exists exactly the same way that it was originally built 2,000 years ago. The builders were the Apostle Philip, the Apostle Nathaniel, and the 2 youngest of 5 sons of Mary, the mother of Jesus, Simon and Joseph. And the young St. John helped. So there were 5 men. Philip and Nathaniel had wives. Philip had, by that time, 3 of his 4 daughters. And with St. John, the entire entourage, number 12. the four sisters with their husbands went to Glastonbury along with Lazarus and his sister Martha, and with Nicodemus and his wife. So there were 6 men and 6 women at Glastonbury. The archetype impressed itself in such a way that it reoccurs whenever someone taps the pivotal magnetic capacity of their differential consciousness enough to emerge their person in the jewel-like lensing quality. And what is lensed out of that is the kaleidoscopic consciousness of historical actuality. That what then happens and occurs actually happens and actually occurs, has a veracity to it. So that the saying then is that while in mythology there are gods and goddesses, in history there is only the Lord of history, is God. Not a multiplicity, and not just a singularity, but a singularity that has all of the complementarities of all of the possibilities. This resurfaced many times in the ensuing 2,000 years. The most powerful time was at the founding of the United States. The guide father of the United States, the Hermetic guide, was Benjamin Franklin. But the first person to really, in a pointed, lensed, laser-like way, to emphasize this was Thomas Jefferson. And it wasn't until 1983 that Princeton University Press published Jefferson's extracts from the Gospels, 2 documents. 1, the philosophy of Jesus. 2, the life and morals of Jesus. And these 2 had been confused and confuted together since the time that Jefferson finished the second of them in 1820. It was in 1804 that Jefferson decided for himself to not only distill for himself who Jesus was and what Jesus did, not did in ritual sense, but did as the art of spirit person making, and who he was, not in terms of his identity in a thought structure, but who he was in the largest spectrum that plays in the cosmos. And so he took a couple of Bibles, a 1791 Bible and a 1799 Bible. And he took a scissors and he cut out passages of only what Jesus said and what Jesus did and excerpted it. And the document was the philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted from the account of his life and doctrines as given by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and added underneath it, being an abridgment of the New Testament for the use of the Indians, unembarrassed with matters of fact or faith beyond the level of their comprehension. But this philosophy of Jesus extracts, it ran to about 46 pages of maybe 5 by 5 inch, were passed out to the members of Congress in 1804 for the re-election of Jefferson. At this time, the reconnoitering of Lewis and Clark across the new continental United States, not a 13-colony United States, nor even the United States going over the Appalachians into the beginnings of the Midwest, but way beyond, several thousand miles beyond the Mississippi River. And that by 1804, early 1805, when he took the second inaugural and delivered it, it was apparent to Jefferson that the Indians were an extremely important soil out of which the original fermentation needed to take place, out of which then that could be distilled and carried further so that one would have a double alchemy. The land, which had been spiritualized by the Indians for thousands of years, it turns out actually 20,000 years or more, that fermentation is the first step in an alchemy. It's not the alchemy so much of final, what you get, of just making the gold, but there is a powering up of a second transform in alchemy, a distillation, where the projective power of the gold symbolically is raised sometimes 1,000-fold or more, so that one does not just make a new materia in existence, one makes an energized material that is able to carry transformative possibilities into whatever it is that man makes out of these. It's like the difference between making bricks to build out of straw and clay, like the ancient Hebrews did in Egypt, and making a sophisticated ceramic with all kinds of additives to it so that you get something that is literally, we have the capacity by the 21st century to make almost materials that will outlast the roots of mountains. We can make ceramics, the life of which in 1,000,000 years you would not see corrosion. We have this capacity because the Hermetic transforms on the planet have come this far. But the great beacon, the great carrier of this, in large part, has been Hermetic America. And that's what we're taking a look at. The quality that comes through is that very early on, in Benjamin Franklin's time already, with Jonathan Edwards especially, and then in Jefferson's time, and remember that by the time Jefferson died in 1826, Emerson was already 23 years old. There is an overlapping continuity in Hermetic America. And with Emerson, it comes into a juncture where finally it is disclosed and revealed. He cannot be any longer the famous minister of the Second Church of Boston. He must leave that and discover his own self, his own prismatic person. And the document that presented that first was his little book called Nature, published in 1836. This is a declaration of not just independence, but a declaration of the interdependence of all spiritual selves, separated from church and state, from tragedy and buffoon comedy, and centered pivotally on a raising from fermentation and distillation, so that the spiritual person comes into play in such a way that they have a harmonic relationship to the reality of the cosmos itself. This, then, is the heritage of Hermetic America. We're going to take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come right back. This home is called the House of the Nightingales, and we've been talking about it before the break. This was the home of Mary Magdalene, and she took care of Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was in her early 60s. Mary Magdalene, when she had this built for her, was about in her mid-40s. And living with them also was the young St. John, who was a teenager. And living nearby were two of the two youngest sons of Mary, the mother of Jesus, Simon and Joseph. And the two apostles that helped build this, Philip and Nathaniel, lived in Hierapolis, nearby to Ephesus, less than 100 miles away. And in fact, the Apostle Philip is buried in Hierapolis, and 3 of his 4 daughters were prophetesses, and they are buried with their father there. They were unmarried. The one older daughter did become married. Inside this house of the Nightingales, as we pointed out, is this contemplation prayer alcove. It has a statue of Mary, the mother of Jesus, because the emphasis is always on transferring, as a psychological term, transferring the archetypal qualities of Mary Magdalene to the mother. And the reason for this is that there is a regression in the mythology, that instead of becoming historical, it swirls back and goes back into, weaves itself back into a mythology. The Virgin Mother and Child are mythological images that have symbolic, doctrinal forms, whereas the personal, historical figures have the ability to relate prismatic, personal lensing of consciousness and nature so that it plays out in an actual historical occurrence and in this way interfaces with the cosmos itself. We've talked about the telescoping of ancient traditions by Jesus in his time, and that the connection was such that all of this was brought to a prismatic focus in his person that was not limited to an identity, not limited to an integral form, but was infinitely scalar on a shareability. And that the first setting of the shareability was with Mary Magdalene. To think that they were married and would have children is a mythological reduction. It is a psychological crimping. It has a lot to do with church and state in their polarities. It has nothing to do whatsoever with the double transforms. What comes out of that double transform is that instead of there being a church, there is a cosmos. And instead of there being a state, there is an alchemy able to transform the things of this world. And that the alchemy and the cosmology are held in their complementarity by a love of wisdom, by philosophy, philosophia. that one's ability to be a lover of Lady Wisdom shows that the transformation from coming into your prismatic person goes into a distillation where you can share that prismatic jewel-like quality with another and another and all others who do this, so that there is a transpersonal community of the blessed. That spirit family is on an infinite scalar and is capable of being expanded beyond the ends of time. And it is that community that then is what is meant when one says it is hermetically sealed. The term hermetically sealed is quite clear. It's used all the time. It's been used for at least 300 plus years. When something is hermetically sealed, it isn't sealed by the form existentially. It isn't sealed by the form mentally, integrally. It is sealed because the inner space of it is made empty. It is vacuum sealed. The most famous mechanical presentation of it was a Magdeburg sphere in Germany. When they first had vacuum pumps, and two metal halves of a sphere were put together and hooked up to a vacuum pump that pumped all of the air out and left the inner part of the sphere as close to a perfect vacuum as they could at that time. And then dozens of horses were reined on both sides of the sphere and could not pull it apart. It's just the opposite of Lewis Carroll's Humpty Dumpty. All the king's men and all the king's horses couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The converse of that, all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot pull that apart because it is vacuum sealed. And so it isn't a 0 point of energy. That's a misnomer and it's a misunderstanding. It is a mental flaw, and forgive me, it's just that they don't have enough yoga. When the personal jewel person is vacuum sealed, they are indestructible permanently. Not indestructible in existence, or one would say at this stage, mere existence. And not indestructible in terms of the brain and its structures of thought, its mentality, but indestructible in that it has a scalar resonance with the reality of the cosmos itself. And that the reality of the cosmos itself, as we well know now, only about 4% of it is physical existential matter. 96% is of a whole different quality that is real nonetheless, but is not limited to existentiality, and that in fact all particles of existentiality freely come into emergence out of the vacuum and go back into the vacuum, and do this in such a rapidity that the energy frequency of a material, of an element, is noticeable on an astrophysical spectrum of the carrier of electromagnetism as an energy, which is light, the photon. All of this is a quality of the person that Benjamin Franklin begins to set the stage for, the context for. Jefferson, as a figure, emerges within that and strengthens himself. And by the time that he won his second election in 1804, as we pointed out, he brought into play a document which is called the Philosophy of Jesus, of cutting out of an edition of the 2 copies of the New Testament published in Dublin in 1790s, 91 and 99. And those documents, those books, still exist, and they're in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. The Philosophy of Jesus was made ostensibly to illuminate for the American Indians the simple presentation of who Jesus was and what he did. But the wider context of it, that copies of this were distributed to all the members of Congress, the House and the Senate, in 1804 for the second term of Jefferson, which was the term that for the first time, the Revolution of 1800, weaning the United States away from the federalist leaning towards having a monarchy, a presidency where the figure is more like a king, the Hamiltonian, Alexander Hamilton quality, where national banking supports the monarchical power of a president who is more like a super king than a president. The Revolution of 1800 was to wean the country away from that. The second revolution of 1804 was to expand the Revolution of 1800 so that it now became a continental country, that Hermetic America spread from sea to shining sea for the very first time. And in doing so, the population of human beings in that further 2/3 of the new America were largely American Indians. And those American Indians needed to be brought into play because they were the spiritual inhabitants of the psychic energy of the land. And that psychic energy of the land needed to be worked with in a realistic way. And instead of having some European idea of what that land should be, cookie cutter imposed upon it, which a monarchy would do, which Hamiltonians wanted to have happen. One took the Jeffersonian republic, that you began to acclimate yourself to the psychic dimensions of the landscape in terms of the people who really had lived there for tens of thousands of years, as we know now. And in doing so, the Lewis and Clark expedition, which did the canvassing of all of this, opened up the trail, which became known later on, literally in the American West, as the Big Trail. The Big Trail originally led to Oregon, not to California. California was a secondary thing. One of the great Hermetic Americans, as we will see, is the great historian Francis Parkman. Parkman's 12-volume history of the United States, starting with the French and Indian Wars, starting with the early French explorers like Champlain and so forth into colonial America. Parkman wrote the 12 volumes so that they would be like the 12 books of Homer's Iliad, so that the American history could be seen in its Homeric scale. And indeed, it was a Homeric scale on which Parkman worked. He suffered from severe migraine headaches, and he could not focus his eyes to read or write many times in his life for more than 5 minutes, so that he would suffer for a half hour, an hour, a couple of hours, and when the pain would go away, he would go back to work, reading and writing on his great histories so that they were made under the most excruciating circumstances. The final volume in that 12-part history is the Oregon Trail. And Hermetic America has this quality. I will bring in next week a book by an early American explorer of the American Midwest. His name was Walter Pidgeon, similar to the actor of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, but perhaps a distant ancestor. But Pidgeon, when he published his book in 1840, it was the recounting of a Sechem of the Fox Indians. Now, the Fox Indians are a tribe from Wisconsin. There's a Fox River. His name was De Kuda. And De Kuda was still in possession of all of the lore and spiritual visionary understanding of Indian mounds in what became the United States. And the reason why the memoirs of De Kuda were written is because as the communities of American families came into the Midwest, they did much as what they did when they occupied the Atlantic coast. They plowed up the mounds, they plowed up the land to plant their crops. De Kuda in 1840 testifies that there was a time when the entire landscape of what became the United States was tattooed with mounds. Tens of thousands of mounds, so that America, in its Paleolithic primordiality, was a sacred land, literally tattooed from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. And that the great American Indian metropolis, Cahokia, was at the place in which the spread of all of the tribes, of all of the Indian mounds in their great, huge, enormous complexity came to the hub there. And Cahokia is in Illinois on the Mississippi River. And if you look across the Mississippi River, you will see the city of St. Louis. And you will see, especially conspicuous in the city of St. Louis, the great Jefferson Arch, 60, 70 stories high. It is an arch, a golden arch, through which will pass the visionary, better angels of our nature to open up the rest of the landscape in such a way that it is not plowed up, but it is brought into play in the transform. And in 1804, Jefferson, in order to sustain the philosophy of Jesus in a primordial American inclusion, began to collect American Indian dictionaries, so that when he retired from the presidency, which he would do in early 1809, his first plan was to take this trunk, he had 50 or 60 of them, back to Monticello and to devote himself to the philological understanding of the primordial languages of the rest of the United States. Unfortunately, on the way back to Monticello, that trunk was lost in a swollen river and never found. But the impetus of Jefferson's, this is how Hermetic America works. It's an impress of actuality that does not go away but keeps re-emerging, because it has a vacuum conscious energy field along with nature. It spontaneously will emerge what is real. And within a generation of Jefferson's attempt that was abrogated by tragic circumstance, you had the beginnings of linguistics in the world because of the study of American Indian languages. And I will bring a couple of large volumes from the Bureau of American Indian Affairs, several thousands of pages, of the first study of human languages comparing the complexity of American Indian languages. The reason for this is that the American Indians kept their language traditions viable, tribe after tribe after tribe after tribe, for thousands, many thousands of years, whereas languages in Europe, because of a melding, because of Romanizing with Latin, because of a development of national languages that sought to extend themselves over others, the language complexity of American Indian languages is much more impressive, many times more. Here in Los Angeles, there were 20 families of American English languages just in the Los Angeles basin. That's more linguistic diversity than all of Europe. The impress was to understand and to not only have an education for the Indians to participate in America, but for Americans to wean themselves away from the limited blinders of wherever it was that they came from and to open themselves up to the land which was no longer a wilderness, but which was a promised land ready for a new people. But in order to inhabit that land, one had to learn to be native in that land. And so you found a great strain of Hermetic America in the early pioneers to make sure that they lived realistically as families, as communities, in the actual place and the actual land in which they found themselves. One of the earliest figures who understood this talismanic Indian quality that helps sophisticate one in the fermentation to the field of a wider visionary consciousness was Henry David Thoreau, who became the first white American sachem. He was the first to understand in a primordiality where it was that he lived in all of its psychic depth, in all of its visionary expansion. And it was proverbial that Thoreau could find Indian artifacts, arrowheads and so forth, spontaneously. Almost any place that he went, he would point out to someone, well, there's one right there. And still unpublished in 2008 are the 11 volumes of Thoreau's Studies of the American Indian, all of the excerpts from reports. It is like a super colossal Lewis and Clark expedition into the spiritual scalar of Hermetic America in terms of the Indians. He made a special box, pinewood box, for the 11 volumes of his American Indian notes. They have never been published, and they reside in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York City. I was fortunate enough to send an emissary and get permission. I have a Xerox set of the transcripts of Thoreau's 11 volumes of the American Indian notebooks. And I will bring some of them with me next time. One of the qualities of Hermetic America is that the alchemy of what exists and the cosmology of what can possibly occur are held in a deep complementarity by philosophy, by a primordial philosophy, which is a love of wisdom. One becomes a lover of wisdom. One is able to put wisdom into one's life so that it occurs as a conscious visionary dimension of your space-time. This is particularly effective. And in Jefferson, we find by 1819, 1820, he redoes the philosophy of Jesus as the life and morals of Jesus. And this time, he takes 4 different languages. He takes the scissors to a whole little shelf of New Testaments, and he puts in parallel columns the English, the French, the Latin, the Greek, so that one can now read in a multidimensional way. He was literate in all these languages. He could read and write Greek and Latin and French and so forth. We're talking about spectacular people. That 4-column arrangement of the distilled essence of the New Testament is the origin of the 4-gospel New Testament, called in antiquity the Diatessaron. And it was first made in the 2nd century AD to present the 4 Gospels presentation of Jesus in parallel columns so that one could read multidimensionally in a scintillating jewel-like matrix, not who he was, but who he will be if you will open your consciousness up to lens prismatically. And the all-time great statement at the end of St. John's Gospel. He says, and all these things and more did Jesus do, and were all of them to be recounted in writing, I would think the world itself is not big enough to hold all the books. It is this expansive infinity of person which is then approached not only in a contextual, pioneering way by Franklin, in a dramatic, focusing way by Jefferson, but out of that, in the early 1800s comes a new generation of Americans born in Jeffersonian America. Emerson was born in 1803. Lincoln was born in 1809. Thoreau born in 1817. Margaret Fuller in 1810. And it goes on and on. Whitman and Melville in 1819. All of the generation that are born in Jeffersonian America have the Sechem quality of the entire continent, so that now the archetypal impress of the energy of Hermetic America maturing largely in the 1820s, 1830s, and by the 1840s, it's evident across the board. And by 1855, one has what was characterized once by a great American Studies master, F.O. Mathieson, in his book, American Renaissance. He said in 1855, half a dozen of the world's greatest books were all published the same year, all by Americans. And it just blew everyone out. Leaves of Grass, et cetera, et cetera. And that it was like a threshold of brilliance that had been honed to writing a new history of man. And it's exactly at that time that you begin to find a honing that was characterized most brilliantly by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He voluntarily left a lucrative, famous, sustainable position as one of the prize ministers in Boston at the big second church in Boston, and left it to go into his own visionary perfection of his character, of his prismatic person. The declaration is brought out most consistently in, let me read here from Emerson. This is from Nature, 1836. This is the very beginning. He has a poem of 6 lines, a stanza, that he prefaces it. And it reads like this: a subtle chain of countless rings, the next unto the furthest brings. The eye reads omens where it goes, and speaks all languages, the rose. And striving to be man, the worm, mounts through all the spires of form. This is, of course, the great ancient Hermetic golden chain of being. This is Homer's golden chain of being. Now, the Hermetic emphasis of this needs to be clarified for us in this way. Why is it Hermetic? When Jesus was crucified and resurrected in 36 AD, it was apparent to him, and the phrase often quoted from the Gospels, he said of the temple, not one stone will stand upon another. And within 34 years, that actually happened. But he said, in 3 days I will raise a new temple. That the temple is no longer an architectonic of existentiality materials, but as a prismatic interplay of energy frequencies that can emerge materials wherever they will be. And that is not so much that it is a temple there where it's supposed to be and stays there, but it has the ability to open up the harmonic of possibilities. One example of this, a great friend of Thoreau and Emerson was Bronson Alcott. And he opened up a special philosophy school called the Temple School in Boston. But within a short period of time, the transcendentalist movement, that one is not dealing with temples that are structures, one is dealing with temples that are harmonic possibilities, that are like musical forms. That the architecture of bricks and mortars is illuminated until it becomes the architecture of music. And that temple of harmonic then led Alcott to found the Concord School of Philosophy, and that was a very large house where he lived, and literally opened his house to be the beginning location. Other buildings were built as if it were like a villa compound. And this goes back, the archetype for this goes back to Plotinus, who taught out of his own home, and even further back, goes back to Jesus teaching at the community on the hill at Taposiris Magna, which we talked about in the first half of the lecture. The archetype of that particular community of small houses, each one having a special contemplative prayer place. The alcove in Greek is called a monasterion, out of which we get the term later on, a monastery. The monasterion was the part of where you live, where your contemplative space exceeds the 4 dimensions of time-space, space-time. In comes the dimension of conscious vision, In comes the further dimension of prismatic person, and in comes the dimension of a historical kaleidoscope, which actually achieves its place in a cosmos which is then an eighth dimension. And that eight-dimensional doubling makes a pair of space-time, so that you have an integral 4 dimensions and you have a conscious 4 dimensions that come together in such a way that they reveal the complementarity of the ninth. That this 9 resonant set is actually not a mythological set of gods and goddesses, but is the harmonic set of the 9 muses. So that the temple of the muses now becomes, the museon, becomes the building, the extension of that building in which one can finally learn how to learn how to deal with the 4 dimensions of the world and of the mind and of the flow of the stream of experience, all within the integral field of nature, but also to deal with the field of vision and consciousness, to mature the person prismatically, to participate in the making of history and not just myths, and the exploration of the cosmos. When Jefferson redid the philosophy of Jesus in 1820, the life and morals of Jesus, he was busy building the University of Virginia, which was a harmonic expansion of Monticello. And there in the central court of the University of Virginia, you have 5 major buildings on one side, 5 on another, that come together in such a way that the central court between them leads on a slight rise to the central structure, the 9th, 10th, the 11th, that quality where the dome of the University of Virginia, the dome of Monticello, is an architectural expression of the dome of the cranium, of the mind, expanding itself to the dome of the heavens. We talked about the incredible expansion of Hermetic America in terms of astronomy, where the size of the telescope in Newton's time, including the observer who would sit by that telescope, was smaller than the central part of the great observatory built, the 200-inch telescope built at Mount Palomar and finished in 1948, planned in 1938. In order to operate that telescope, the observer had to sit in the eye of the telescope at the pinnacle of it, way up in the air. Not only are those bones going to dance around, the relationality of astrophysics in the cosmos is going to dance visionarily in anyone who is able to sit in that seat. It is a mercy seat indeed, able to look out on the cosmos. Next week we'll take a look at one of the great developments in 1966. It was the beginning of the second phase of the San Francisco Renaissance, the high point of the 1960s. It happened in Longshoremen's Hall in North Beach. The theme was America Needs Indians. And in Longshoremen's Hall, a whole series of Indian teepees from all over the United States were set up, permission to get the Longshoremen's Hall came from the great longshoreman philosopher Erich Hoffer, who I was interviewing at the time. And America Needs Indians, each teepee was filled with new technologies that were being shared for the first time in the center of that floor. It's the first time anyone ever saw a light show. It's the first time that anyone heard some of the new music that was coming out of the groups at the time. Some of the new swirl, psychedelic type art themes, and many other aspects. And it was the first time they were brought together, January 1st, 1966. It was a Jeffersonian America, Hermetic, reaching back, because the circle of the houses at the Therapeuti community was a circle that was open and allowed for a passage to go to a central structure. The 12 arranged little houses and the central structure were the original shape of the Glastonbury community. In that passageway leading up to that center were buried St. Patrick, St. David, King Arthur, Queen Guinevere, and a whole host of archetypal figures that were put in the alignment that this is the center. And the archetype of that shape became the round table in chivalry. The theme of the Grail is one of the deep secrets that we will talk about next week, and how it was revealed in such a way that the American quest west led finally to the new frontier, up and out. And the exploration of the star system, largely spearheaded by Hermetic America, proceeds even today. More next week.